Welcome into the Odds and Audibles podcast. Matt Bream, Eric Scopel, Jared Mack on this show today, Friday. A little late start than normal, but hey, we're here. The live stream's on. We've got people on the show. We're going to do a mailbag, and then we're going to open up the stream to your questions surrounding probably Oregon football, probably Oregon recruiting, and who knows where else the stream could go.
Yeah, no, that'll be the plan. Kind of a traditional Monday show on a Friday. Kind of got our wires mixed up this week a little bit. I think going forward we'll shoot for doing more Monday mailbags, but Friday doesn't hurt either. At least you guys get your mailbag. First question from @JTBobo13. With the transfer portal additions, do we have a good feeling about the offseason, or do we think there is more to do after spring? #Otson Audibles. I thought this was just a good kind of baseline question. I don't know if we've really gone into detail, just kind of evaluating the totality of what Oregon has done to this point. And to that point, do we feel good about the offseason? Yeah, I think Oregon has had a really strong offseason. We just had Chris Hummer, 24/7 Sports transfer portal kind of analyst on our podcast on Wednesday. Go check that out if you missed it. And he was really high on the additions Oregon had made, and that was prior to Tasheem Johnson being added from Ole Miss, which I think is, and we haven't talked about in a podcast, I think a really significant addition. I mean, how many times, Jared and Matt, have we talked about, who's going to be the nickel? Are they going to move Jamal Hill back? Are they going to, is Kamari Terrell or JJ Greenfield some kind of lesser name ready to emerge? Well, they don't have to have those conversations anymore because Johnson is a prototypical nickel safety. So he's going to, I'm pretty confident, fill that spot that Bennett Williams left with his departure. So I think they've plugged pretty much all the holes that are on the roster, with the exception of tight end. And I guess that would be where I would go to kind of the follow-up part of, do they think there's more to do after spring ball? Some of that's going to be dependent upon Oregon and who they lose. They obviously have to get under the 80 or get to 85 or fewer. And I think the count is it 91 today, Matt? Is that where we're at? Yeah. 91 scholarships. So there's some work to do from a, cutting. I'm trying to. What's the right term? How do we want to frame this in terms of just?
Yeah, it's not cutting.
I know. It's not, and that sounds
players leaving the program,
turning over the roster.
Yeah, they have more roster turnover. That's right. Good point, Matt. That's a good way of putting it. There's more roster turnover to be done without question. But I think just to me, the one obvious spot is tight end, where you have 3 scholarships right now. You do have a 5-star recruit in Nichols Harbor on campus. I believe he's already arrived for his official visit this weekend. They might snag him. That might change kind of the math on this, but I probably am coming around to Jared's opinion a little more of just like, it just seems like you probably need to find somebody in the portal just to kind of solidify that group, even if you do land Harbor. So I think that's the one big spot I look at. I think from a numbers perspective, it's just hard to argue to add too many more players on defense with just the glut you have at a couple spots. But if a player is good enough, you take them. And I assume Oregon will kind of go into that, the May transfer portal window thinking, hey, there's a guy who's really good here. We're gonna make a move. We're gonna pounce. We're not gonna hold back just because we're at so and so scholarships. So. But I think it'll be really fascinating to see what Oregon's approach is in terms of how they get down to 85 and then who they approach after spring.
Overall, to answer, do we have a good feeling about the offseason, quote unquote? Yeah, absolutely. I think Oregon went into this offseason basically knowing who was going to leave the program in terms of the NFL draft and early entrants, and have a general idea of who was going to leave the program via the transfer portal. We had a list of 20, 21 guys that we had originally for our transfer portal list.
Yeah, it's about that.
I think there's maybe 2 or 3 pre-written articles that we haven't used yet. So I would imagine the staff had a similar idea of of who they expected to leave. And for the guys that they brought on, like Eric mentioned, they fill all the holes that are necessary. They needed depth at safety. They needed a cornerback to replace Christian Gonzalez. They needed linebackers, obviously. And they've hit a lot of those needs. And Tysheem Johnson, I share Eric's opinion with. I mentioned this on the podcast multiple times before about how he was just a true nickel safety or a nickel corner, whatever you'd like to call it. Plays inside the box a lot more than a normal free safety would or a normal safety would. And that's huge because we saw last year that Bennett Williams was Oregon's nickel safety, and he was good at times and not great at other times. And I'm not saying Tysheem Johnson is going to be the best nickel safety of all time, but he finished last year with 78 tackles, 4 tackles for loss, 2 or 3 passes defended. I can't remember. All those stats are more than any safety on Oregon's roster. The 78 tackles is more than anybody on Oregon's roster. And he did this all in the SEC at Ole Miss, playing for Lane Kiffin, and throughout most of the season, the top 25, the top 20 team in the country. I really like all of the transfer portal additions. In terms of if there's going to be any more after spring ball, we'll have to find out. We'll have to wait and see. Like Eric said, obviously they have to get to 85 or under. That's a given. So, yeah, there's probably going to be more transfer portal additions via subtractions for Oregon's roster. But there's also going to be a lot of competition. This is the whole point of having 92 or 91 guys on your scholarship chart, is so that you can tell which guys aren't going to be playing. And either you do that vocally and say, hey, fella, you're not going to be playing. Or B, the competition shows them that they are not going to be playing and they need to go find another school. That's the whole part of having that many guys on the roster. And I would expect there to be more transfers out from Oregon's roster after spring ball, and I would expect there to be more transfers in, because you never know who exactly you're going to lose, and you never know who's going to hit the transfer portal. I would think Oregon would be a major player for any position of need, obviously, in the transfer portal, and then if there's a big name guy, I would expect them to go out and at least try. Go fish, see if you can catch a line, and if you do, take them in and say, all right, guys, this is X. He's going to be in your position group room. Good luck. I just think that that's going to be the mentality here with Dan and company for a long time.
I think you look at this recruiting class and you say that they've got the 9th best transfer class in the country. They've got the 10th best overall class in the country from a recruiting and transfer perspective. And I think you feel positive about the roster turnover. They've improved the depth at corner, at safety. I don't know, like Jared said, I don't know if it's going to be significantly better, but you feel like you have more options now. And that was maybe one of the issues that we had with the defense last season was, at corner, you had 4 guys essentially, and you couldn't rotate anybody else in to try something else. At safety, you had, just a couple of guys that played those position groups. It's very similar to what like Oregon basketball on the men's side went through with their guards. Like, this is just the guys that they have, and it's not getting better, it's not getting worse. And so they've retooled that position group, and you have more bodies there. You have better depth there, and so if one guy isn't playing well, or if this guy just doesn't fit the scheme, it's not working for him, you've got other options to try at that position. And that's probably, I think, the biggest thing for me that I take away at that position group is you've got options now. I do feel like they've addressed some of their needs, especially in the transfer portal. I mean, you go out and you fill your nickel spot, you fill out your edge, your pass rusher guy, you find a linebacker that can come in and help you right away, which was a position group that was lacking depth, lacking production, and you add a cornerback to that position group as well. And I think one of the biggest things for me is you look at the 10 guys that they've landed, and you can say 7 of them are definitively starters and at their previous schools. Justin Jacobs was a starter. Junior Angelau was a starter before he got hurt this year. Cornelius was a starter. Tez Johnson was a starter. Evan Williams was a starter. Jordan Birch was a starter. And Tysheem Johnson was a starter. Maybe they didn't start every single game, but they started a majority of them to qualify as kind of like that full-time guy. Even Holden and Kerry Jackson. Guys
Holden was a full-time starter, I think, at Bama this last year.
Yeah. So, you're adding players with starting experience, and some of these guys in the best conference in college football. Alabama It's in the SEC. Last time I checked, South Carolina is in the SEC, and so is Ole Miss. And all three of those teams had really good years this season for their programs, and you're adding starters from those teams. So I think you should be excited. I don't know if we can say like definitively Oregon is going to be a college football playoff team. You can't say that right now, but the foundation and the pieces are put in so that this team should be better next season. Now they just have to execute it.
Yeah, well, and that's the other part, and I guess before we move on to the second question, I guess we should also acknowledge I liked the hires they made from a coaching perspective. We talked about transfer portal additions, and that was kind of the way this question was framed: is how do we like the player acquisitions? I like both the coaches that they hired as well, in terms of just like, and those were important position coaches. Your number one on command on offense, and kind of your number two in command on defense. Like they lost two of their more valuable assistant coaches this offseason, two guys that had, long histories and ties with Dan. Both of those guys move on, and I think they've gone out and replaced those coaches with other young coaches that are exciting and bring something to the table. So I think just in general, just the additions they've made so far feel good, and I think outweigh the departures. That I want to make sure that doesn't get misconstrued. And I'm saying that Oregon, from a coaching perspective, has upgraded necessarily, because both the coaches they lost also upgraded their own career positions. And you could kind of probably argue are two of the more up and coming coaches, from their age range out there. So I'm not saying that the additions are better, but I think certainly you feel really good about where they've landed and kind of how Lanning has shored some things up here. All right. Second question from @DuckForQuacks. Heading into spring camp, what position groups are you most excited to watch at practice? And then he goes, fingers crossed you get to see more 11 on 11. I also share that that hope. Whether it be the competition for the starting spot or the new guys at that position. #OttsandAudible. So the question is, what position groups are we most excited to watch? I have several, as you would imagine.
Mm-hmm.
And we should note, I have no clarity of what our practice access will look like when spring practice starts. We started to lose a little of that access during fall. I have no idea if that'll be the case again, but if we're assuming we get the same kind of access we got last spring, which might be an incorrect assumption, then I guess I'll just focus and say I'm really curious to see how the defensive backs kind of shake out, and more specifically the safeties. I look at that group and say, gosh, you've got so many guys with starting experience. And at some point, there's almost too many players at that group for it to almost work, which is a weird way of saying it. But I look at it and think there's going to have to be a couple guys who either transfer out or just accept that they're going to be backups who haven't been backups in previous seasons. And Steve Stevens has started essentially the last 2 seasons. Jamal Hill has been a starter for 3 seasons. Brian Addison played a ton of snaps and was, according to PFF, your second best defensive player. Now, I don't know if we all agree with that, but certainly was somebody who was a positive contributor. And then you bring in Tyshim Johnson and you bring in Evan Williams, who I did my say to the safety position kind of depth chart prediction. I have both those guys in my starting 2 deep right now. So there are several veteran safeties who played big roles on last year's team who remain with the team, who are going into spring fighting for the positions that they had this past season. So I think that's what's going to be really fascinating for me is, what is the approach of Jamal Hill and Steve Stevens and Brian Addison now that there's enhanced competition for their starting roles, right? A year ago, they had to fight for it, and they ended up winning their jobs. And guess what? I don't think safety play was very high on anyone's list of performers this past season. I don't think safety was a strength for this defense. In fact, along with inside linebacker, I'd argue those are probably the 2 biggest weaknesses. The fact that they went out and added players who are, as Matt kind of outlined, starters, whether it be in the SEC, the Mountain West, but that kind of caliber of player to challenge these guys, I think it's going to be fascinating to see how they hold up. And then the flip side kind of goes back to the first question is, do we see a guy or 2 from that group transfer? Whether, are there guys that look up and say, gosh, I was working with the 1s all of last year and now I'm with the 2s. What do I want to do? I have 1 more year of eligibility, because that's also the thing that ties together that trio I mentioned with Hill, Stevens, and Addison, where all 3 of them are in their final years of eligibility. And it comes down to these are 5th and 6th year guys. Do they want to sit on the bench at Oregon if they don't win their starting jobs, or do they want to look around? So I think that's going to be, for me, the biggest kind of group I'm most closely watching.
I wonder if those guys already made that assumption though, where they might be on the bench for their final year at Oregon, but that's just kind of where they're used to, because they can see the additions that Oregon is bringing in. I mean, Oregon was 7 hours away from landing a 5-star safety in Peyton Bowen as well. So Bowen, excuse me. So I just kind of wonder if they're kind of content with that, where even though I don't know, like Stevens and Addison were both competing for the number 1 spot, and then neither of them got it with Bennett Williams and Jamal Hill, and taking that starting safety spot. I know Steve Stevens did start. I know, Eric, I could see you looking at me.
Well, I was just perplexed by the
Steve started for most of it, but I mean, for spring camp, it's such a big difference between what it's going to be for fall too. We Eric, you and I, every time we went to 11 on 11 or practice during spring, it was always BA and Triquez Bridges at safety, and then that never came to be. I'm interested to watch that safety room. To get to the question, I'm interested to watch it. I just have a really hard time seeing some of the guys who came back being the starters next season. And I kind of wondered in the back of my head, why are they coming back? Because I just feel like Oregon is going to add there, because like you finished your statement with, safety was not the best played position last season. There were moments where it was good, but overall, I don't think anybody would really take it over again. That was a clear upgrade for the coaching staff that they needed to make. So anyways, competition, position groups, I'm looking at slot receiver. I think that's going to be the biggest competition I see on offense. Maybe one of the tackle positions, whether it's a Johnny Cornelius or Josh Connerly starting at left tackle. To me, I'd like Connerly. Cornelius, I just want to watch and see what he looks like. Same with Junior Aguilar, just to see what he looks like coming off of an injury. Excited to see Jordan Birch. I want to see what Trayshawn Holden looks like in this offense. Overall, I want to see what the offense looks like under Will Stein. And then, again, this is barring that we are able to see 11 on 11 competition, which who knows? Maybe we do, maybe we don't. Dan, if you're listening, I hope you allow us to watch some 11 on 11. Nate Kruger, if you're listening, I hope you mentioned it to Dan that we should watch some 11 on 11. But I think slot receiver is my number 1 right now. I really think the Tez Johnson and Chris Hudson competition is going to be fun. Depending on who wins that job, there might be someone who hits the portal from that overall slot position, which I could see happening. But both guys are really have a lot of competition and a lot of success, even at Troy and at Oregon. Hudson was Oregon's 3rd leading receiver last season. I think it's so. Tez was one of the best rated receivers by PFF and put up just ungodly stats at Troy last year. So I think that'll be a good competition. I can't tell you who's going to win now, but I'm just excited to see both of those guys. And I'm excited to watch Tez Johnson in person because of the numbers he put up at Troy.
38 players are currently committed to Oregon in the 2023 recruiting class. Almost half the team. So this feels like a blanket answer, but I'm excited to just see half the team for the first time. That's pretty wild to think about. And if we do get better access for spring football, which historically has been the case under previous coaches, Lanning included, I would think we glean a lot. And so I feel bad. You guys, I said a lot, and some of the stuff I would say, so I'm not going to rehash that. So I'm just going blanket. Half the team's going to be new. And just seeing how that all fits in and how the leadership fits in. And I think one of the storylines that's not been talked a lot about, I can't speak this morning, is the fact that when a basketball team turns over half its roster, you're like, oh, that's a big amount. But it's well, there's still 6 guys here. It's only 6 people. It's six and six. you can look at the leadership and, hey, this is how we do warm-ups. This is how the routine is. This is what we do. Work on this thing. You get that peer-to-peer leadership still even when like 70% of a basketball roster is turned over, because it's only like 7 or 8, 9 guys. When half your roster is turned over for football, when you say that, 40 dudes, like, just the logistics of operating a practice or player run practices or leadership capabilities, like, the returners are going to have a lot of pressure on themselves to set the stage and set the table for the new guys to know and understand, like, this is how we do things. This is what we do. This is how this practice works. This is what this drill does. Like, it's going to be rough, I think, in first 3 or 4 days of spring football with that many new players.
Yeah, I was just realizing we are going to be, at some point during spring camp, we'll be writing oh, man, it's just tough to get these practices run the way we want. There's so many new guys, blah, 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 blah. There's going to be, or maybe they won't come out and say that, but that'll be at least a line of questioning to Dan of like, oh, what's just the execution in practice like with half the guys being new players? That's fair. Just one last one that dawned on me as we were kind of wrapping. I think the offensive guard position stuff could be kind of intriguing to follow too, with Harper and Jones and Angelau kind of competing for the 2 spots. We kind of touched on that one earlier this week, I think. I can't recall. Oh, it was in our position rundown pod on Monday. Just another one that I'll be kind of curious to see how that shakes down, because I have senses in my head of what the offensive line left to right looks like. I think a lot of other people that are kind of also in the industry that I've spoken with have had a little different opinions. So I'll be just kind of curious to see how all of it fits together and kind of where everybody lands. I think that's the big thing on the offensive line. I think we have a really good idea of who the 6 guys who could start feel like they will be. It's just, okay, where do they all fit together, and what's the right combination? So I think that's another one to kind of monitor. Third one from @Ross_Maselich. With the additions of Johnson and Williams, does that all but confirm Jeffrey Bossa remains at inside linebacker, or does he move back to strong or free safety due to the additions of Jacobs and the play of Keith Brown in the bowl game? #Odds and Audibles. Well, we floated the Bossa moving thing a while ago. I don't see it at all anymore. It was interesting doing the position exercise, just kind of running through other positions this past week. You really get a sense for, like, gosh, they have next to no experienced inside linebackers, just not a lot of bodies, and boy, do they have a lot of experienced safeties. So I don't really see the value of moving Bossa, who's one of your 2 inside linebackers with really any meaningful experience that's returning. And then you, of course, add Justin Jacobs into the conversation, who's very much contending to start. Like, I just don't see why you would do that. And then from a fit perspective, like, I know we've been really high on – I mean, he was recruited to play safety and nickel. I hope I'm not being too critical, because I feel like I probably am one of the people who's most critical of Bossa. I just don't know if some of the things that were shortcomings at linebackers aren't going to be shortcomings when he's playing safety.
It's going to be even worse.
I just think you're putting a guy who's had a hard time making open field tackles in positions where he's going to have to make more open field tackles. Yeah. So, yeah, I don't know. I would be skeptical of that. I think Bossa is sticking out at linebacker because, again, I think they have 7 scholarship inside linebackers right now, and they have, I believe it's 11 scholarship safeties, or 10, if you 10 or 11. It's 10 because JJ Greenfield is not in scholarship. Yeah. There were 11 guys that mattered when I was doing the exercise, but I think just 10 who are on scholarship. So, like, I don't see what the benefit would necessarily be of moving Bossa to that group personally, but open to anything, expecting that that's not a thing we see.
Yeah. Ross, thank you for the question, but no. If Bossa were to have moved back to a safety, it would have been last spring ball with Dan first being here and seeing that, oh, this guy's not fit to play linebacker. They went the entire season with Jeffrey Bossa, basically the entire season, as their starting linebacker next to Noah Sewell. Mostly because Justin Flo did not pan out and was injured and then never really got back to playing at a high level of college football. But to Eric's point, yeah, it's just everything that he struggled with last season and coverage and making open field tackles. That's exactly what a nickel safety does. He drops into coverage or covers a guy one-on-one down the field and makes open field tackles. That's why Bennett Williams, even though he had his bad games, a lot of people liked him, including me, where he could go up and hit somebody in the open field and make a tackle. Yeah, there were games where he missed a couple of those, but that was Basa a lot in terms of missed tackles in the open field. He just couldn't wrap up, and moving him to free safety would be something where he'd have to do that on a more game to game, play to play basis. And they certainly aren't moving him to safety because of Keith Brown. This is something where I'm not surprised. We talked about this before the bowl game, specifically me, where people get overjoyed and excited about a young prospect. And I was picking Devin Jackson to be that guy for me. It turned out to be Keith Brown because he did really well in the bowl game. It's one game. I mean, we gave the red flag warning of, hey, don't get too lost into the bowl game performance because it is one game. Keith Brown, I'm sure, will have a nice career at Oregon, and I'm sure he could do something where he turns into an actual starter this upcoming season. But we have to see it on a full game-to-game basis, a full season basis. We have to see it in spring camp where he's the starting linebacker with Justin Jacobs, or maybe it's Jeffrey Bassa. We have to see it game one against Portland State where he's the starting Mike or Mac linebacker. I'm not ready to fully move anybody out of the linebacking room because of Keith Brown's emergence, because we've seen, 48 minutes of Keith Brown's emergence. So that's just that. That's just a PSA, a public service announcement for those who are still on the Keith Brown train, which I don't blame you for. He played really well in the Holiday Bowl, but we just got to see it more often than not.
I think Boston stays at linebacker. I mean, I also don't even know if he's best suited for safety. Like, I think that was the plan coming in, but just watching him in coverage his freshman year and then watching him in coverage this season, he took a dip down. And I just don't feel like it would be at his best position playing him at safety. I think he would get abused sometimes. Maybe abused isn't the right word, but teams would pick on him with his lack of speed at that spot.
Yeah, especially if we're talking strong or free. Like, he just doesn't have I don't think he has. And he wasn't even working at those positions before moving to linebacker. Like, he was either nickel or no. So. Yeah, it's sorry, Ross. It's a no from these guys over here at the Odds Not Levels podcast. And I'll also acknowledge that was something we kind of discussed earlier, this month or late last month, whenever. Was just like, where does he fit? I think these additions make it pretty darn clear he's staying there.
We get asked about it a lot, surprisingly.
Yeah. Well, because I think people still have a lot of hope for Bassa, which I do as well.
I think I'm one of his biggest fans. Like, I think he can be really good. It's just that he didn't have a good year this past season.
Yeah. I just think it's clear that he's a linebacker now. Like, if he was going to be a safety, they would have immediately moved him after his freshman season, where they said they had more depth at linebacker. They brought guys in. It's like, okay, Jeffrey, we do not need you to play linebacker anymore. Please go back to safety. But Dan and company must see something at linebacker just like Mario and company did. So I think it's pretty clear at this point that he's going to be a linebacker for the foreseeable future.
All right, we're gonna wrap up our mailbag portion with a men's basketball question. So this is going right to you, Matt. And this is, by the way, fresh off a 75-69, I think I got the score right, win over Colorado on Thursday, which was a little more stressful than it needed to be for those who were watching from home and probably those who were at Matthew Knight as well. Matt can get to that if he wants to. But from at March Madness 83, next season, men's hoops brings in 2 5-stars. They're both talented, but they're both role players. Shellstad is an alpha, but not necessarily in year one. Should fans be pessimistic about next year if Oregon doesn't go all in to secure one of the top transfer guards? Hashtag Odds Notables. Matt, what say you?
How do we define role players? Because I think Kwame Evans and Mookie Cook have good chances of starting next season. And a lot of that also depends upon what some upperclassmen at Oregon do. And you'd be like, well, what do you mean? Dante could come back, and there's a legitimate possibility that happens. I don't know if it's one way or the other right now, that he stays or goes. I truly think it's like a 50-50 deal right now for Oregon. They're trying like heck to get him to come back. Maybe this latest injury changes that perspective from Dante's perspective, but if he comes back, he's your alpha of this team. I think it's pretty clear this season that when Dante plays well, Oregon plays well. What does Quincy Guerrier do? He could go to Oregon again for a fifth season because he's got the COVID year. He could transfer out and go to another school for a third time. Same question for Rivaldo Soares, and same question that you have for Kuznar. I think in an ideal scenario for Oregon, you get all three of those guys to come back. And in that case, then yeah, like Kwame Evans, KJ Evans, and Mookie Cook, finding a starting spot for both of them is going to be hard. Finding a spot for one of them will still be hard. So yeah, then they become role players, but that means your bench just gets significantly better. The NBA scouts love both players. We should note that Kwame does have a little bit of a reputation as, lacks the killer instinct motor type air quotes that we've heard about Kalel. I don't know if it's as prominent as Kalel was, but it's out there. And we should also note, Mookie's not like this pure shooter either, but he's a jack of all trades that can play any position essentially for you. I do think Jackson Shelstead could be a day one starter for Oregon as a true freshman. He's very, very good. And the problem for Oregon, though, is that they are trading Will Richardson's, graduation, moving on for a true freshman. You still have the issue of, even if Kuznard comes back and Bartholomew comes back, you still need another ball handler. And you still need probably another shooter on this team. I think the idea that Oregon should be a favorite to win the league would be a false narrative. I think the expectation that they'd be a tournament team would be very true, very fair. Can this team be one that wins the league? Yes. Can this be one that gets to the second week of the NCAA tournament? Yes. But some of that is going to be dependent upon what they do in the offseason via the transfer portal, or maybe they add another piece. Maybe it's Bronny James, another kind of combo guard, a guy that's a really good shooter, and seems to have taken a next step in his development. And something else that could happen is Stojakovic. He's currently signed with Stanford. Jared Haas is probably going to get fired. And does he open things back up again? Oregon was a finalist there. Really good three-point shooter. That's exactly what Oregon needs. Maybe it fits in there. But I think you look at this program and say they should be a tournament team. You can't say yet that they should be the favorite or a favorite to win the league. But the ceiling is there for that. I think you should be excited, but I think you should have like a reserved judgment of, until this team kind of shows out and proves it on the court, it's unrealized potential, and you don't want to put too much stock into it.
That feels like the trend, right? With these teams under Dana has just been a lot of 5-star talent, and expectations get excited and risen, and then it's just doesn't quite match up. It seems to be the recent trend.
Yeah. I thought that this for the question from March Madness 83, I thought it was an interesting question. Should fans be pessimistic about next year if Oregon doesn't go all in to secure one of the top guards? Yeah, there's a chance they should be, because it's kind of what has prohibited this team, at least this year, taking off. They don't have any ball handlers outside of Will Richardson, or didn't for most of the season because of injuries. And you see how important that is. And it's going to be even more important with Kwame Evans and Mookie Cook. Jackson Shelstad is a ball handler and guy who can move the ball around. But again, he's going into his first year in college. I think, like Matt said, I think he can be a big-time contributor. But even if Oregon were to land Bronny James, he's another guy like Mookie, like Kwame, where they're not going to do great with the ball in their hands. They're going to need ball movement. And again, that's what a Dana Altman team is. They need ball movement. They need quick decision-making processes. They need guys who can find the open man in the corner. They need shooting. So you have all these guys that could come back, and N'Faly Dante and Quincy Guerrier, Jermaine and Keyshawn. But I know that it's a possibility for Dante to come back. I just think that's if you're Dante, like, this is the best he's played, this is the best he's looked. If I were him, unless the NIL makes it such a big difference, I could see him being a second-round draft pick just because of how well he's played. But he's also going into his, I think next year is going to be his final year eligibility, Matt, if he decides to come back.
Yeah.
He's showing everything that he can this year. He looks amazing this season in terms of his health. But it depends if those guys come back. But if you're Oregon, you got to go find somebody who can control the ball. You got to find a true point guard. If those guys don't come back, if Kuznar and Barthélemy come back, you could be in a good position with Shellstad and with Bronny as kind of a combo guard, a 6'4" combo guard. But you need to find somebody in the transfer portal if those guys leave, because these 5 stars are going to need help. Dana Altman's 5 stars seem, other than like Troy Brown, seem to be different than other teams' 5 stars in terms of they're not the immediate offensive need. They don't immediately fill a void offensively. And Bull, don't get me wrong about Bull, but they're what a Dana Altman team is full of. It's like 6'7", 6'8" wings who can defend all 3 levels, who can occasionally shoot, but who play hard-nosed defense. And, you don't really get that from Clay Ware this season. But at points when he's locked in, you see it. I just think that Mookie and Kwame, and if they land Bronny James, those guys are going to need a lot of help on the perimeter. They're going to need ball handlers. They're going to need an offense to get them set up and to get them going, because I don't think those guys, other than a little bit of Bronny and mostly Jackson Shellstad, I don't think those guys can really create their own bucket. So I think it's an interesting question that's brought up. That's brought up really early, like way before this season ends and way before next season begins. But I think it's an interesting question.
With Dante, he's only 21, and the thing to remember is he reclassified into the 2019 class to join the Ducks that season early.
Mm-hmm.
So he's ahead of schedule by 1 year for where he normally is at. So it wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility for him to come out and say, technically I should be a senior next year anyway, so let's do it. But I think the injury concerns are up there. Yeah. He's playing at his best. Is he going to be better now, significantly better next season than this year? I don't know. Does his family need the money too? We don't know that answer either. NIL is
just wonder,
a big thing.
Yeah, I just wonder, what else does he have to prove at this level? He's doing really well when he gets the ball, when he's on. He's one of the better centers probably in the country, but definitely in the Pac-12. I just wonder what else he has to prove to NBA level guys, because they've seen it all during his time here.
I think the answer to that is, Dana talked about it on Tuesday a little bit, is he's now getting double and triple teamed. And every time he gets the ball, and how does he handle that? And the games that he has 3 or more turnovers, they're 1-6 on the season. And the games when he keeps his turnovers down, they're obviously, I think they're 10-1 before that, or 9-1. I can't remember what the record was before the last night, but I think that's where the improvement needs to come. That's where he can show is he's consistently getting double teamed, and he's had his moments where he's handled it very well, but he's also had his moments like at Stanford a week ago. He didn't handle it well. Against ASU at home, he didn't handle it well. 4 turnovers in that game. UCLA, another game in which they probably could have won that game. I don't know if I'm going to say should, but they could have won that game. He had 5. UCLA just doubled him, and he couldn't handle it. And I think that's the growth that you're looking for, is can you become comfortable playing with the double teams, because you're going to get that in the NBA. You're going to, until you show you can. So that's where I would say, if he comes back, that's where he works on, is being able to handle the attention that comes with the reputation of being a dominant low post scorer. Because you're right, Jared, he owns the school record for single season field goal percentage at like 65%. And he's at 62% right now. Like he's on pace to have the number 1 and the number 4 best field goal percentage in a single season twice. Like that's pretty darn impressive from a scoring standpoint. But that, I guess like the transition away from Dante, I wanted to mention this comment is like both Eric covers the women, Jared's been both. I've watched a good chunk of the women's games, and I think the biggest thing that Oregon's missing on the men's side right now is just the skill of the game. Like Oregon's athletes are on the men's side are phenomenal. They have got great athleticism at every position, but just watching the women play, you see the skill, you see the IQ. Dana talked about that on Tuesday too. Like this team just sometimes forgets what they're doing on the court. And I watch the women and appreciate just how skilled they are and how well they play together. The passes are crisp. There's no thinking. They just immediately swing it to, one more spot, and you get a wide open three. You don't see that happen very often with the men's side. I think, and that's probably the area you're trying to improve the most from the men's perspective is, can you add more skill? And I don't know if it's going to come through the high school ranks. It's going to have to come through the JUCO guys or the college transfer guys.
I think the deficiencies of each program right now are inverted.
Yeah.
Oregon on the women's side just can't defend anybody, and has having and it has had a really hard time standing up to pressure as well. But in terms of full court press, I don't know how much women's basketball talk we want to do because I've seen the comments on the YouTube about when we talk women's basketball, and it's just it doesn't capture people's interest, which is too bad because I would of course devote ample time talking about it. But no, I think you're onto something there in terms of, Matt, of kind of what the issues, because neither program's playing super well right now, but you've got one team in Oregon on the women's side that, gosh, offensively, they look really, really good sometimes. And of course, there are times where it's not as good. And I think the last couple of games, Grace Van Sluten has had a really hard time. And that's been a big part of kind of just a more global issues they've had offensively of just not having a consistent interior presence. But gosh, their defense has been awful the last couple of games during this kind of losing stretch. And on the men's side, I'm not saying the defense has been great, but that's just kind of a built-in, is they have the length and athleticism to stack up and hold up. Whereas the women's, the way the roster is constructed, they just don't have a lot of big wings to hold up against other big wings. And so you've got a lot of smaller guards who are quick, but not physically developed enough to hold up. And then obviously inside they've got, I think, one of the better interior presences in Shea, but she's such a project on offense that you can't play her 32, 33 minutes. And I don't know from an endurance perspective, she's up for doing that either. So there's our women's basketball top, because I'm sure we want to transition now, maybe take a break and go to the comments.
Yeah, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll dive into the comments on the chat section of the stream. All right, welcome back to the Odds and Audibles podcast. Let's dive into this one. I thought this was interesting. I remember at the beginning of the show seeing this. We've seen DeBoer, Dickert, and Heupel and others recently receive contract extensions. Those are first and second year head coaches. When do you see Oregon extend Dan Lanning? I think the interesting part of all of those three guys is they didn't inherit a program like Lanning did that played for the conference championship the year before. I think Lanning probably deserves a raise, but I also think he kind of did what was expected of him this season. All three of those schools, their head coaches far exceeded year one, year two expectations for their programs, for where they were at when they joined the program.
I was exactly where I was going to go. You just look at, Washington won, 4 games in 2021? They won 11, 10, 11? Was it 11? They won 11 games last year?
11 and 3.
Really impressive. I mean, that's a 7-game turnaround. That makes sense that you would extend that coach and try to keep him around for the long haul. Dickert, I think they won 7 games, which at Washington State is really
Pretty good.
That's pretty darn good, especially considering, by the way, that they were the worst of the Pacific Northwest teams, right? And all 4 Pacific Northwest teams were bowl eligible this year. And I'm understanding of that. And Heupel at Tennessee stands for itself. That was a breakout season here where for a while it felt like they might be, well, until they played Georgia and proved they weren't, that they might be the best team in the country. That was a national talking point until they played the real number 1 team in the country and were beaten pretty soundly. So it makes sense that all those coaches, as Matt said, elevated their programs, took it to another level. DeBoer and Heupel in particular, that adds up. And if you look at Oregon with Lanning, depending upon how you want to look at the season, and I want to make it very clear, I'm a huge fan of Dan Lanning. I think he's done an awesome job, and I'm really optimistic about the direction it's going because of what they've done this offseason. But just based purely on the success of 2022, 10-win season, didn't play for a conference championship, played in, by their standard, a lesser tier bowl. Nothing that he did this year screams you've got to extend him, right? And you think about Mario, who I believe was extended twice during his 4 years here, or at least renegotiated his deal. Both of those, I think, came after conference championship winning seasons in 19 and 20. Okay. And so you reach a certain threshold, you attain more financial compensation, whatever else it is you negotiate for in your contract. So I think once Lanning shows he can live up to what the expectations have been in terms of winning a conference championship and elevating, and like if Oregon wins 11 games and wins a Rose Bowl next year, he deserves a contract extension. I don't think there's any question. If Oregon makes a college football playoff at any point, he's going to get a contract extension. But I think winning 10 games, not playing for a conference championship, and winning a Holiday Bowl, if you do that over and over again, you're not on the hot seat at all. Like Oregon fans, I hope, don't get to the sense of, gosh, we're only winning 10 games year after year. This is a disaster. We've got to make a change. But if he isn't winning conference championships and playing for Rose Bowls, like at a certain point, you do get frustrated. So that's to me what would, and like I don't even know if I'm not going to say Dan would sit there and go, I don't want a contract negotiation. I don't want more money. But I think he would even probably be honest and be like we did a lot of great things this last year, but I'm not sure I did enough in year 1 to deserve a reworking of these deals, because you don't just arbitrarily make extend coaches like that, and you have to accomplish something significant. And I think Lanning, at least on the field this last year, while the season had some real highs, ultimately you look at it and go, it's not a failure by any means, but I don't think it's a rousing success either.
Yeah, I mean, Dan's going to get an extension eventually. The other thing that goes into this is Dan's already making, or was making, significantly more than all the other coaches on that list in his first season. Dan, his starting salary was $4.85 million. I think he had an incentive hit as well. I don't remember it off the top of my head. So he made more than that. DeBoer was making 3.
I think he made $200,000 for the bowl.
Sure. So it's $5 million at this point for Dan in his first season ever as a head coach. DeBoer was making like 3.4. Dickert was making 2.7. So Dan was basically making double what Dickert was making. And Heupel just got $5 million add-on. So he's making $9 million a year. So he was making 4 earlier. So I think that plays into it too, is that Dan is already pretty well paid. But I agree with both you guys where, he needs more experience, and I don't mean that in a negative way. But again, the college coaches' prices at this point, you're getting into like the $10 million range, the $8 to $10 million range for the elite coaches. I mean, Mel Tucker, elite coach, $8.5 million a year, 9.2.
Is he an elite coach?
No, not at all. That's why I said it in that funny voice. Mario Cristobal, 10 years, $80 million. But he at least had, he got more from Miami, but that was Oregon's offer. But he had a track record. He had 2 Pac-12 championships under his belt. He had 3 straight that they competed in. Once Dan puts together 1 or 2 of those, I mean, with what he's doing off the field, and frankly, what he's doing on the field as well, he'll be fine. Like, I'm not worried for Dan. If Oregon doesn't pay him, which I hope that they do, because I do like the trajectory that Oregon's going to, someone will. Someone will pay Dan hand over fist and say, hey, Dan, here's $8.5, $9 million a year. And whether it's Oregon or not, like, someone's going to pay him because he's going to have success. It'll come. I don't think there's any reason to worry about if he's going to get a contract extension. Although, Eric, I know you mentioned like Oregon fans wouldn't be calling for the hot seat if they get 9 to 10 wins every year.
I said 10. I
Isn't
said
that
10.
exactly?
I didn't
Isn't
open
that
the door for 9.
exactly what Michigan did?
What's that? I said 10 wins, but yeah, I understand your point.
Right. But isn't that exactly what Michigan did with Harbaugh? Where they get
Well,
like 9 or 10 wins
he
every single year, but
still has his
they
job.
just lose to Ohio State, and then they call for him to be fired, and then he ends up restructuring his deal to get like his pay in half. So I wouldn't put Oregon fans out of that notion.
Absolutely.
I
I want to be clear. I'm not saying irrational Oregon fans wouldn't be calling for her. I think, but just like the average run of the mill rational fan.
If Dan keeps losing to Washington or Oregon State,
sure.
Yeah, like Harbaugh does every year, except for the last 2.
Yeah, except for the last 2 years when they played for the college football playoff, and he's salvaged things. But yeah, no, that's fair. All right, Matt, do we have another one?
From Nick Flowers, we've seen so many new players come in who are obscenely high caliber, starting caliber. How realistic would it be for Dan to put all this talent together and, for example, get us to a college football playoff? I'm assuming he's talking about 2023.
Seems like it.
First and foremost, Dan will face probably the toughest Pac-12 that we've seen in 6-7 years, maybe more. I don't know. Like
more than that, I think.
Yeah, like I just kind of picked like a long number and threw it out. Like it really is going to take us a long time, I think, to find a year in which going in on paper the Pac-12 has been tougher. So I think that's the first hurdle that you have to get through for Dan. It's going to make it hard for Oregon. It's going to make it hard for Washington, USC, Utah. Like to get to the playoffs, if you get out of that Pac-12 and you make the playoffs, you are going to be really good. Because it's not just us who are in the Pac-12 saying that. We had Hummer on, we've had Marcelo on, and both those guys said that they think the league could be maybe the best league top to bottom next season. They're maybe not going to have like the best team at number 1, but just the overall depth is going to be the best in the country maybe. So I think that's the biggest hurdle. Is the talent going to be there? Absolutely. Like pieces are there. The ball bounces your way correctly. You get a couple lucky bounces. Yeah, I could see this team get to the playoff. I don't expect it, but I think it's something that you have to discuss because they don't play a juggernaut like Georgia and non-con. Texas Tech will be a hard game. It'll be a tough environment, but that's a winnable game. That's a game I think all three of us go in saying, like, if Oregon and Texas Tech play their best football, Oregon's probably the better team. And then they play in a neutral site. It's Oregon. Getting through conference play is going to be hard, but should it be the expectation? No. Can it happen? Yes. That's I guess that's how I answer that question.
Yeah, I think if we're looking, so I anticipate the offense is going to feel a lot like what this last year's offense was, and that might be wrong. I saw a question actually in the mailbag which we didn't use, which was, I thought, kind of a good interesting thought exercise of are we setting the expectations almost too high for Will Stein in his first year as play caller at Oregon, because Oregon's offense was so darn good under Dillingham last year. I don't know if I totally agree with that, but I think we are to a certain degree, and I'm admitting kind of fault right now as I'm going through this exercise of saying I think Oregon's offense will be on par with what it was last year. It is no given that under a new offensive coordinator, everything fires in all cylinder day one and looks awesome the whole year. Like, I think the Dillingham experience, even against Georgia, I know that they didn't score any points there. It wasn't super impressive. People had questions, but boy, by the time they got to BYU and then into the conference season, people were kind of picked up on, boy, he's really good at this. I don't know if it'll be quite as seamless with Stein. So, that there's one component there. The defense, and I think this is what Nick's getting at, talking about the higher caliber of players. I do think the defense should be better because it can't really get worse if you think about it, right? In terms of the talent that they brought in terms of just experience that talent will have playing in this defense. So I anticipate the team is a little better this year, but to Matt's point, and I think the point that we've had a couple of national people on we've talked about it was, and I think Chris Hummer said it straight up on Wednesday because Matt asked a question about like, is this the year the Pac-12 breaks through with the college football playoff team? And his point was the conference is so loaded, it just probably going to cannibalize itself. Like it seems difficult when there are 4 to 5 teams that are considered, real conference championship contenders, that there aren't going to be enough hiccups, or I should say that that a team's just going to make it through unscathed. I think that's a tough ask. And you look at Oregon's schedule, we've talked about it. It's I think a somewhat favorable schedule in certain areas, but there are like legitimately 4 really tough conference games in there.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's realistic the team is better. I don't know how realistic it is that they get to a playoff. I just think that becomes the expectation this time of year every year for Oregon fans, and I understand it because that should be the ultimate goal. I just think sometimes we set the goal almost a little bit higher than is rational, and then people get really frustrated because the season's a disappointment because they win 10 games every year. So I like, do they have the talent to be a really upper echelon team? Sure. I just will have to see it before I believe it, I guess, to a certain extent too.
Yeah, I think that's the ultimate message about this is that, the college football playoff should be the expectation. Is it realistic? Sure, if things click right. I mean, it was realistic last year for a long time. There's going to be ups and downs of every season. It just depends how Oregon can handle them. Last year's downs were really hard to handle because it was Bo Nix being injured. Last year's downs were Kenny Dillingham leaving at the end of the season, an injury to Chase Cota, the entire defense for multiple weeks during the season. But overall, the talent together on this roster could be a college football playoff team. If they win the national championship, I don't know. It's a couple teams down south that might have a say in that. But here I am. Welcome to my corner of the world again. The Pac-12 needs to get rid of the damn 9-game conference schedule, for Pete's sake. They need to get rid of it. This would help Oregon. This would help the whole conference not cannibalize each other. For maybe if the teams continue to be this good, that'd be great. I have my wonders on if they'll be this good all the time. But again, an eight-game conference schedule gives Oregon, gives USC, gives Washington, gives Oregon State, gives Colorado in 2 years, according to Joel Klatt, gives those guys a break during the end of the season to not go and travel to Utah or USC or Oregon or all these other places that I just listed to. That's the difference between making a college football playoff or not, because Georgia isn't traveling to Alabama in November 13th when they're 11-1, and so is Alabama. Those games just cannibalize each other. The SEC figured it out. They said, hey, we want 2 teams in the college football playoff as often as we can. Let's make it so our brand not only looks better, but is better on paper against other opponents. So this is a Pac-12 conference issue that I just wanted to get into really quickly. But to answer the question again, yes, it's realistic. It's possible. Is it likely? Probably not. No. I'll just say that right now. No.
Let's throw this one up here. Eric Johnson. If we, as in Oregon, went 10-3 again this year, would that be considered a failure? I don't know if failure is the right word. If Oregon went 10-3, I probably would be a little disappointed. But I would also have the caveat that, hey, the league is at its best. It's been in a very long time. It's going to make it hard. Like if you're 10-3 and your losses are to teams that are in the playoff, in a New Year's Six Bowl, and another 10-win team, that's hard to get disappointed about. You played good teams and you lost. It happens. But if you've got if you're 10-3 and in there you've got a loss to a 7-5 team and a 6-6 team, then yeah, that's disappointing. You played down to your competition and lost.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say, not all 10-3 seasons are created equal, so there'd have to be a little bit more nuance to determine that. I think if it's 10-3 with losses to Oregon State and Washington again, and they don't play for a conference championship, and they win a bowl of similar caliber, like if it feels like it's almost a repeat of 2022, I think you're a little disappointed, because you do bring back enough on offense to be really, really dynamic. and also you just want to see a little bit of progress on the field to a certain, you know what I mean? And like obviously you're not falling back any at 10-3, but you also expect to see a little bit of improvement. So, but if it's 10-3 and it's your losses are to USC, Utah, Washington, I don't know, maybe Texas Tech. Let's say Texas Tech. Let's say they beat both their rivals, and then they play and win the conference. You know, they win the conference championship, go on and win a Rose Bowl. Then sure, that's not a disappointment at all. So it kind of depends on how you get to 10-3. But I think if it's just a pure repeat of this past season, I wouldn't say it's a failure, but it isn't enough progress to be celebrated. But if you go 10-3 and that ends up being a conference championship and you win games over both your rivals, which are going to be tough games again, I think you feel pretty decent about that, and you should celebrate a season like that.
Yeah, and I feel like we just went over this. It's not a disappointment, and like Eric said, all 10-3 seasons are not considered equal or created equal. It's a tough schedule. I still think it's a tough schedule. I know they get all these games at home. I still feel like it's a hard one to have. The Pac-12 is really good this upcoming season, at least on paper. It's going to be difficult for them to finish anything but 9 or 10-3. I really think so. For them to go and sweep the conference or go 8-1 into the division, and on the division in the Pac-12, I think it's going to be really difficult. I think it's going to be difficult for every team in the Pac-12 to try to do that. There's a lot of offense. Every quarterback that was good last season is coming back, and then you add DJ Uyunglele. There's going to be no shortages of talent in the Pac-12. And thankfully for the transfer portal, that's how that happens. That's a good side of the transfer portal. Don't let anybody tell you differently. It's going to be really difficult for anybody to do better than 10-3, I think, in this upcoming Pac-12 season. So, yeah, it wouldn't be a disappointment. I would get if we were disappointing in, I don't know, a couple years ago when there's some real bottom dwellers in the conference, where you have like an Arizona or maybe Washington State, where they're like 2-10 or whatever the case may be, where they're really poor. But you're not going to have that outside of Stanford this year.
All right, Jared, this one's going right to you. I don't know if you saw it. Solf 1,
Whoa.
question for Jared.
Baseball question.
More than likely. What's your outlook on Oregon baseball this year? Higher ceiling than last year, you think? Quick rundown. Baseball did start doing their media availabilities. You had like 4 or 5 stories up this week on baseball. I guess give us the quick rundown of where this team is at.
Sure thing. Let's see. Yesterday was the first practice of the season, or at least like the official season. They had fall baseball practices. Today's the first scrimmage, so I'll be doing that later today. But yeah, overall, I mean, I think the team offensively, it's going to be a Mark Wasikowski team. It's going to hit really well. It's not going to pitch really well. Isaac Aon is hurt and should miss a portion of the season. He was their Friday night guy, so that's a big loss to start the season. There's other injuries that I cannot get into, but will soon enough turn out when the season starts on February 17th against Xavier for a 3-game stretch. Offensively, they return Tanner Smith and Drew Cowley, Gavin Grant, Colby Shade, Jacob Walsh. They got a lot of guys who can absolutely rake. I think it's going to be a really fun offensive season to watch. I think the team in general, if it's a nice day in Eugene and you want to watch an offensive explosion, you want to watch the fun parts of baseball, come on down to PK Park, because it's going to be fun on that side of the ball. Pitching was kind of nightmarish at points last season. It might be, I don't know, it might be worse this year just because they have to rely on some freshmen to do a lot of it. I think their bullpen should be better, but as long as they throw strikes, it could be a lot better than it was last year. I plan on having Mark Wasikowski on this podcast at one point. I got to figure that out with Todd Miles, our lovely SID for the baseball program. So stay tuned for that. Yeah, I think Oregon should compete. I think they should be a top 4 seed in the Pac-12, but pitching is going to be something. There's still 3 weeks before the season starts, so I'll have more on that as the season comes up. But as of right now, it looks like the biggest question mark by far.
How do we judge a successful season for baseball, you feel like?
Well, they've made it to 2 regionals in a row now, 21 and 22. They hosted in 21. I would say a successful season is making it to another regional. I would say a very successful season is hosting a regional. I mean, all of them, everybody wants to go to Omaha, which is the College World Series, but it's difficult. And when you don't have clear pitching advantages over any team or a lot of teams, it becomes even more difficult. But I think a successful season this season would look similar to what it was last year. I think they were 36-25. So anywhere from 10 to 12 games over 500.
All right. Trying to pursue the chat, and I don't see anything else in here. I think it's time. We've hit over an hour, just over an hour. Is there anything you guys think that needs to be mentioned in this chat? Or
I'm gonna look through here.
Great. This is great podcasting.
I don't really see.
Yeah, anytime.
I don't see a lot. There's this.
Thank you.
From Brian McKee.
Yeah, I was messing with it earlier, Brian.
Brian says Jared is too concerned with his hair. So,
yeah. At least it's a nice comment about the hair.
It looks, and we should also say for those who are podcast listeners, Brian also says looks good, bro, with a smiley face. So all the positivity.
Thank you, Brian. We love positivity on this podcast.
Yeah, I don't think there's much else left.
All right. We'll jump out. Thank you for submitting your questions. Thank you for watching the live stream. Thank you for listening on the podcast format. Really appreciate it. We've seen tremendous growth. People are staying around watching the videos for a really long time, which is tremendous as well. Until next week, when we'll start talking some recruiting signing day. The second signing day period is around the corner. That's to look forward to on the podcast next week. But until then, you've been listening to the Odds and Audibles podcast.
Talk to you later, folks.